What is up, guys? It's Brandon again, and I'm going to be dropping a new War Thunder video on you guys today. This one is going to be about the Battle of Midway. This was also an event that was taking place over the past couple days. I think it's closed now, but the Battle of Midway was the main turning point in the Pacific where the Japanese Imperial Navy took the hardest blow. Now, the U.S. took this opportunity to pounce on the Imperial Navy to do as much damage to the fleet as they possibly could. Now, this all took place 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and the American Navy started to become a pain in the neck for Admiral Yamamoto. This was because the carriers were not at port when the attack took place at Pearl Harbor. Now, they were doing a substantial amount of damage to the Japanese. For example, the U.S. carriers attacked the Marshall Islands. Then, 3 weeks later, the carrier Enterprise attacked Wake Island. And then another week later, the USS Enterprise also attacked Marcus Island. Now, the stake through the vampire's heart, the Doolittle raid happened, where B-25 Mitchell launched off the flight deck of the USS Hornet, who was escorted by the USS Enterprise, and launched the attack to strike the heart of Japan. This is when the Japs realized that the homeland isn't safe, and there are still US carriers on the loose. Now, Admiral Yamamoto devises this really technical plan to take Midway Island and ultimately lead the U.S. carriers into a trap. Now, there's this man by the name of Admiral Chester Nimitz who has a secret weapon up his sleeve, basically. He has the Navy code breakers who have been working around the clock to break the Japanese code. Now, they know that an imminent battle is going to take effect at a place called AF. This is basically the Japanese secret code for, say, the place that it's going to attack at. Now, a lot of officials think that the attack is going to take place at Alaska's Aleutian Islands as a start of a land invasion. Admiral Chester Nimitz actually thinks this is going to take effect at Midway Island. Now, the Navy code breakers end up broadcasting a message saying that Midway is suffering from a water shortage. Now, within 24 hours, the Japanese end up sending out a message saying there is a water shortage at AF. It turned out Chester Nimitz's hunch was correct. Nimitz then knows the way that the Japanese will attack, so he basically maneuvers the carriers into a staging point 200 miles northeast of Midway Island. When the carriers come into place, the U.S. will basically launch bombers and torpedo bombers in a full-scale ambush and inflict as much damage as possible. Now, around 6:30 a.m., American scouts search for the carriers, but it's too late, basically. The Japs are already soaring on Midway Island, and they're already starting their bombardment of it. Now, back to the Enterprise and its task force. By 7 o'clock, the Enterprise ends up getting word that Midway Island has been attacked, and this is the cue for the pilots to get ready. Now, B-17s are also launching off the island to go attack the Japanese Imperial Navy. Now, there's an American sub called the Novelist, and this is really the turning point that you guys have got to pay attention to. Without this, I don't think that the American bombers would have gotten to the carriers. Now, the sub-Novelist spots the carrier Kaga and seeks to destroy it. Just as it's getting ready for a torpedo run on the Kaga, a Japanese Zero comes out of the sky and sees it and ends up shooting rounds into the water, just trying to throw it off course. Now, this gets the attention of a Japanese destroyer, and the destroyer ends up dropping depth charges on the submarine trying to destroy it. Now, the Novelist decides to play it safe and dive below water. This causes the Japanese destroyer to start basically tracking it. Now, the Imperial Navy's task force of carriers basically ends up changing direction, and they end up going right head-on into the path of the USS Hornet's torpedo bomber squadrons, 2 of them. And the torpedo bomb squadrons end up going right for the carriers, and basically all of them end up getting blown out of the sky. There's only a few that end up making it back to the carriers. Now, SBDs and torpedo bombers from the Yorktown, their flight squadron, ends up going out in search of the carriers, but to their disbelief, the carriers aren't where they should be to do that course correction. But a pilot named McCluskey the guy who's leading the squadron, sees a little trail in the water. And guess what? It turns out to be the destroyer that was tracking the submarine. Now, this destroyer ends up taking McCluskey and his squadron straight to the Japanese Imperial fleet. And this is where shit hits the fan for the Japanese. Right as the Japanese fighter support takes off heading towards the American carriers, McCluskey and his squadron comes in and ends up bombing the shit out of the Japanese. Now, the Japanese end up losing the Kaga, Akagi, and the Soryu during these strikes. Now, the Soryu ended up getting ravaged by the dive bombers of the Yorktown, who just completely ended up decimating the aircraft carrier. Now, the Hiryu is the final carrier who is left in the battle for Midway for the Japanese Imperial Navy. Scout planes end up finding the Enterprise and its task force, relaying the information back to the Hiryu. Now, the Hiryu ends up launching bombers that are heading straight towards the Enterprise and its task force. Now, the first carrier that is lined up in their sights for when the bombers get there is the USS Yorktown. Now, these planes, these bombers, are so eager to get there. They are flying through hordes and hordes of anti-air fire. They're getting past Wildcats, and when they get to the Yorktown ends up taking 3 direct hits to the carrier. Now, fires are spreading, and the Yorktown is quickly patched up, and the fires are put out. Now, a couple of hours later, another strike force of Japanese attacked bombers, this time they're carrying torpedoes, end up going straight for the Yorktown again, so this thing basically turns into a punching bag for the battle. And they end up mistaking it for another carrier because they didn't expect it to have the fires put out that fast, and they didn't expect the flight deck of the thing to be that clear. So they end up going in for 2 direct torpedo hits on the thing, and they end up leaving the Yorktown crippled in the water but still afloat. Now, from the Yorktown being pitched at an angle because of the torpedo hits, is taking on water and there's severe damage, planes from the Yorktown are unable to land on it. Now, these planes end up either having to ditch in the water or find another carrier. Most of them find their way to the USS Enterprise, where many of them land. Now, later that evening, the Hiryu's spotted, and the Enterprise ends up launching pilots that landed on it from the Yorktown and Enterprise pilots on a flight path to the Hiryu. Now, after an hour of travel, the bombers end up getting there, and they end up dive bombing the Hiryu, basically just destroying it, just dismantling it. And that basically sums up the end of the Japanese fleet in the Battle of Midway. Well, guys, to basically sum it up for you, the Battle of Midway ended with the Kaga, Akagi, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. All the Japanese carriers, the 4 of them that were there, ended up getting destroyed. 228 Japanese bombers and fighters were also lost, as well as a cruiser that was scuttled. And over 3,000 Japanese sailors and pilots died in the Battle of Midway. Just remember, guys, I don't pride myself to say that the Japanese had a huge loss of life during the Battle of Midway. This was a big loss all the way around for loss of life, that is. But basically, the Japanese Imperial Navy was no more after this. There was still some major conflicts with them, but it just wasn't as big as this. This was the biggest battle in the Pacific. And it was very sad as well. Many pilots, many good men lost their lives on both sides. So just remember, guys, I don't pride myself on saying lost a life. So thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed these historical facts about it and the gameplay. So thanks for watching, guys. My name's Brandon, and hope you enjoyed, and have a nice day.